It's November 22. 1728. Just before dawn, you're standing on the deck of a sloop anchored off Ocracoke Island, North Carolina. The air smells like salt water, gun smoke, and rum. Mostly rum. Around you, men are still half asleep, passed out after a night of drinking. The stars are fading. The swamp fog is creeping in low across the water, and then you hear it. Note a cannon, not a battle cry, just the soft, deliberate creak of oars cutting through dark water. You turn. Two ships are approaching fast. No lights, no flags. You have maybe 4 minutes to wake the crew, load the guns, and figure out whether you're about to fight, flay, or die. The man standing next to you, the one with the long black beard braided with lit cannon fuses, the one every merchant captain in the Atlantic has had nightmares about for the past 2 years. That man grabs his cutlass and doesn't even flinch. His name is Edward Teach. The world knows him as Blackbeard. And in roughly 4 hours, everything that defined the golden age of piracy will be dead. Most people think piracy ended because governments got tough, or because the oceans became too dangerous, or because the romantic dream simply faded. But that is not what happened. What actually killed it was one Navy lieutenant, one humiliating morning, and one severed head swinging from a bowsprit as a warning to every sea thief still alive. This is that story. To understand why November 22nd, 1718 matters, you have to go back and understand what Edward Teach actually built, because it was not just a career, it was a system. The Caribbean and the American colonial coast had become the most dangerous stretch of open water on Earth. Not because of storms, not because of navigation, because of approximately 2,000 active pirates operating with near total impunity across a theater stretching from the Bahamas to the Carolinas to West Africa. Historians call this period roughly 1716 to 1726, the golden age of piracy. And at its center stood Edward Teach, like a human weather event. He started, as most things do, with someone else's opportunity. Teach served as a privateer under the Jamaican captain Benjamin Hornigold during the War of the Spanish Succession. When the war ended in 1714, the British Crown dissolved its privateering contracts overnight. Thousands of trained sailors, men who knew how to fire cannons and board ships and navigate open ocean, suddenly had no employer and no income. The Crown essentially handed the sea its own pirate problem and walked away. Hornigold and Teach made the obvious choice. Teach had separated from Hornigold and captured a French slaving vessel called La Concorde near the island of Martinique. He refitted her, mounted 40 guns on her hull, renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, and sailed her into history. She was roughly 103 feet long, and she was a statement. No pirate sloop could outgun her. Very few naval vessels in the entire Atlantic theater could either, but the real genius was not the ship, it was the theater. Teach understood in a way that most of his contemporaries simply did not. That fear was a logistical tool. If merchants surrendered without a fight, nobody got killed, no cargo got damaged, and no time was wasted. So he cultivated a persona with almost cinematic deliberateness. He braided his beard into thick ropes, tied them with dark ribbon, and before battle, he would weave slow-burning cannon fuses into the braids and light them, standing on the bow of the Queen Anne's Revenge, with smoke curling around his face and a brace of pistols across his chest. He looked like something that had crawled out of a sailor's worst nightmare. It worked with terrifying efficiency. Ship after ship surrendered without a single shot fired. In 1718 alone, he captured and looted over 40 vessels. What most history books skip over is the politics. Teach was not simply a criminal. He cultivated a relationship with Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina, who accepted stolen goods in exchange for overlooking Teach's activities. Teach used the harbor at Bathtown, North Carolina, as a safe port. He had a system, he had protection, he had, for a brief and genuinely extraordinary moment, something close to legitimate power, which made what happened next not just a battle, it was a takedown. But here's what nobody talks about. Blackbeard did not lose that morning because he was careless. He lost because someone had been watching him for months, and that someone had no legal authority whatsoever to do what he was about to do. Before we go further, drop a comment below. Did you know that Blackbeard essentially had a corrupt governor in his pocket? Because history class definitely skipped that part. Let me know what you think. His name was Robert Maynard. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, Royal Navy. Assigned to HMS Pearl, stationed at the Virginia colony. Not a captain. A lieutenant? This is the detail that gets quietly buried in most retellings. Because it is deeply uncomfortable for the triumphant narrative, the man who ended the golden age of piracy was not dispatched by the Admiralty in London. He was not leading a fleet. He was a mid-ranking naval officer operating on the personal authority of Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, who had no formal jurisdiction over the waters of North Carolina, where Blackbeard was operating. Let that sit for a moment. The most consequential anti-piracy operation of the 18th century was technically unauthorized. Spotswood had been trying to deal with the Blackbeard problem for months. The pirates' arrangement with Governor Eden made him essentially untouchable through legal channels. Eden was not going to arrest his own business partner. The courts in North Carolina were not going to prosecute a man who was economically valuable to the local economy, and the British Admiralty, operating from London with a months-long communication delay, was not moving fast enough for Spotswood's satisfaction. So Spotswood did what powerful men do when the system fails them. He went around it. In November 21211, he secretly hired two small sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, fitted them out at his own expense, and placed Maynard in command. The entire operation was funded privately. There was no formal naval commission for this specific mission. Spotswood did not even inform the North Carolina government of what he was planning, presumably because informing them would have been the same as informing Blackbeard. Maynard had roughly 60 men across both vessels. No cannons worth mentioning. The shallow waters around Ocracoke Inlet made large armed ships impossible to navigate. This was going to be a close quarters fight, and everyone knew it. Now here is where the personal dimension becomes critical. Because Maynard was not simply following orders. He was building a career. A successful kill of Blackbeard would mean prize money, promotion, and a name that would last. He was ambitious, methodical, and this matters. He was not afraid of Blackbeard the myth. He had done his reconnaissance. He knew approximately how many men Teach had. Roughly 19 at Ocracoke that night, down from a larger crew. He knew the layout of the inlet. He had a plan. He also knew that if Teach escaped, Spotswood's entire unauthorized operation would be an expensive embarrassment. There was no exit strategy that ended well except a dead pirate. On the night of November 21st, Maynard anchored his two sloops near Ocracoke and waited for dawn. Across the water, Blackbeard's men were drinking. They had no idea someone had been watching them. But even if they had known what happened at dawn, would still have shocked everyone on both sides. Here's a question for you. If Spotswood's operation was technically unauthorized, does that change how you see Maynard as a hero? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This is genuinely one of history's great moral gray areas. Dumb. November 22nd. 1718. Maynard's men quietly cut their anchor cables, not raised them. Cut them. Because raising an anchor makes noise, and began moving their two sloops toward Blackbeard's vessel, the Adventure. She was a sloop of roughly 90 tons, smaller than the Queen Anne's Revenge, which had been lost on a sandbar earlier that year, under circumstances that remain historically suspicious to this day. Teach had 19 men. Maynard had around 60, but they were spread across two vessels. The inlet was treacherous. Sandbars ran through it like hidden teeth. The Ranger, Maynard's second sloop under the command of Midshipman Hyde, ran aground almost immediately, dead in the water. Then, impossibly, the Jane also ran aground. Both of Maynard's ships were stuck in the sand at the start of the battle. Blackbeard's gunners fired one coordinated broadside and killed or wounded 29 men in a single volley. Midshipman Hyde was dead. The Ranger was out of the fight entirely. This is not how the romantic version of this story goes. Maynard ordered his surviving men below decks, a deliberate tactical deception, making the Jane look abandoned or crippled. Then he ordered his crew to toss stores and ballast water overboard to lighten the ship and pull her free of the sandbar. While Blackbeard's men watched what appeared to be a ghost ship drifting toward them, Maynard was quietly refloating his vessel and massing every man he had in the hold. Blackbeard made the decision to board the Jane. His men threw grappling hooks, pulled the two ships together, and climbed over the rail. Maynard's men came up from below. What followed was one of the most documented close-quarters combats in naval history. Not because it was large, but because it was intensely, grotesquely personal. Contemporaneous accounts describe Teach taking 5 musket balls and more than 20 sword wounds before he finally stopped. The account from Maynard's own report, preserved in British naval records, states that Teach was still fighting after the 5th shot, still standing, still dangerous. He died on his feet. Give the man that much. One of Maynard's sailors, a Scotsman identified in records only as one of his men, made the final cut, a deep slash across Teach's throat from behind, while Maynard engaged him from the front. The whole battle, from first contact to Blackbeard's death, lasted approximately 4 hours. But killing Blackbeard was the easy part. What Maynard did next, and what it triggered across the entire Atlantic pirate world, is where this story gets genuinely dark. That tactical move, ordering his men below decks to fake a ghost ship, is something they still study in military strategy today. What do you think was going through Blackbeard's mind in that moment? Leave your take below. Maynard severed Blackbeard's head. He hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane, the long wooden beam that juts forward from the bow of a sailing ship, and sailed back to Virginia with it dangling over the water like a lantern. This was not savagery. It was documentation. In 1718, without photographs or fingerprints. A severed head was how you proved a kill and collected a bounty. Spotswood had offered £100 for Blackbeard dead, the equivalent of roughly 2 years' wages for a common sailor. Maynard needed the proof, but the symbolism landed far beyond the bounty office. The image of Blackbeard's head on that bowsprit traveled up and down the American colonial coast faster than any newspaper could print. Sailors talked, port workers talked, merchants talked, and what they communicated, in the visceral language of a decapitated pirate king swinging over dark water, was this: the age of operating with impunity is over. The timing was not coincidental. 1718 was the year the British Crown's Act of Grace, a pardon offered to pirates who surrendered, officially expired. The government had tried the soft approach. It had not worked well enough. Now the hard approach was demonstrating what non-compliance looked like. Within months of Blackbeard's death, the dominoes fell with remarkable speed. Charles Vane, one of the most violent pirates of the era, was captured in early 1719 and hanged at Port Royal, Jamaica. In March of that year, Stillabona the Gentleman Pirate, a wealthy landowner from Barbados who had abandoned his estate and his wife to pursue piracy, an incredibly strange life choice, even by the standards of 1718, had already been hanged in Charleston, South Carolina in December 1718. Just weeks after Blackbeard's death, Calico Jack Rackham was captured in October 1720 and hanged in November. His crew members, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, arguably the 2 most famous female pirates in history, were captured with him. Onebewan, the names that had made the Atlantic ungovernable, were removed from it. The network that had sustained the golden age of piracy, the corrupt governors, the willing fences, the safe harbors, began to collapse as the legal and political cost of association rose sharply. Governor Eden of North Carolina, Blackbeard's protector, died in 1722, having never been formally charged. But he never openly sheltered pirates after 1718 either. Power is often less about force than about the credible threat of consequences. And yet the story that history tells about all of this is almost entirely wrong in one crucial, uncomfortable way. The collapse of the pirate network after 1718 is honestly one of the fastest social systems failures in history. Did you expect it to unravel that quickly? What do you think could it have survived if Blackbeard had won that morning? Tell me below. Here is the uncomfortable historical truth that pirates themselves would have found bitterly funny. The golden age of piracy was not ended by moral progress, or by the inevitable march of civilization, or by brave heroes finally choosing to enforce the law. It was ended by a jurisdictional dispute, a privately funded hit operation, an ambitious lieutenant who needed a promotion, and a governor who was tired of waiting for London to respond to his letters. The myth we built afterward, the romantic pirate, the freedom-loving rebel against empire, the man who chose the black flag because he refused to be enslaved by a rigged system. That myth contains real historical truth. Many pirates in this era were former slaves, former indentured servants, or displaced sailors who had been brutalized by merchant captains operating under contracts that gave them near total control over their crews' lives. The ship democracy some pirate crews practiced, with elected captains and written articles governing the distribution of prizes, was genuinely more equitable than most systems their crew members had lived under before. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, who would become the most prolific pirate of the entire era after Blackbeard's death, capturing over 400 vessels before his own death in battle in 1722, is said to have stated that the short and merry life was preferable to a long and miserable one working for someone else. He was not wrong about the conditions he was comparing it to, but the myth also obscured something important. The Atlantic trade routes that pirates preyed on were not abstract systems. They were the supply lines for colonial settlements. When pirates blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, in May 1718, Blackbeard himself led that operation. Holding the harbor hostage for medical supplies, real people ran out of food and medicine. The romantic pirate does not usually appear in the same frame as the colonist watching their child go without. History rarely fits inside a single moral frame. It never did. What Maynard's 4-hour battle actually demonstrated was something more nuanced than good versus evil. It showed that informal systems of power, corrupt governors, tolerated piracy. The gray zone between privateer and criminal are sustainable only as long as the people enforcing formal systems lack either the will or the means to intervene. The moment someone with enough ambition, enough funding, and enough disregard for jurisdictional niceties decided to act, the entire informal structure became fragile overnight. That is not a story about 1718. That is a story about every era. Which brings us back to the morning where this all began, and to the one question that nobody who studies this period can quite let go of. We're almost at the end, and I genuinely want to know what you thought of this video. Did it change how you think about pirates? Or about the systems that enable people like Blackbeard to exist in the first place? Please, take 30 seconds to leave a comment. Every single one gets read. And your thoughts genuinely shape what stories we tell next. Remember that moment at the beginning. You're standing on the deck of a sloop off Ocracoke Island. The fog is in. The oars are cutting the water. The man next to you with the smoking beard doesn't flinch. Here is what you know now, that you didn't know then. He wasn't fearless. He was a man who had built a system carefully, piece by piece, the ships, the reputation, the political cover, the corrupt harbor, the myth of invincibility, and who had genuinely come to believe that the system would hold. He was wrong about that, in the way that people who benefit from broken systems are always eventually wrong. Not because the system stopped working, but because somebody on the outside stops finding the cost of tolerance acceptable. The 4 hours off Ocracoke did not just kill Edward Teach. They demonstrated something that governments, institutions, and individuals have rediscovered in every century since informal power built on fear and tolerance has an expiration date. You just never know when the oars are going to start cutting through the water toward you. Blackbeard's head hung from that bowsprit all the way back to Virginia. A warning written in the only language that crosses every cultural and legal boundary without translation. The golden age of piracy was over. Not with a cannon salvo, not with a fleet, with 2 sloops, 60 men, 1 lieutenant who wanted a promotion, and 4 hours in the fog. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. Subscribe to Pirate Compass for more stories like this one. Stories that history class was too polite to tell you properly. And remember, the next time someone seems untouchable, check the water for oars,